Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I have the pleasure to open the first in this semester seminar on international relations organized by the Institute of Political Science and of Public Administration, Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński University in Warsaw. Our special guest of honor today is Professor Aleksandru Grigorescu from Loyola University in Chicago. Please welcome him. Thank you, Professor, that you've accepted our invitation. It is a pleasure that we will have the opportunity to listen your lecture, to share your scientific endeavors, and I hope we'll be able to ask some questions to the topic. I would like to give the floor to the Vice Rector of our university, Professor Ryszard Sadowski, to welcome our guests and to open the seminar. Please, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. I'm sorry, I will read because I like very much to listen to my words. So I'm afraid that you will have not enough time to ask questions, important questions to our distinguished guests. So let me invite everybody reading this important message which I prepared already. On behalf of our rector, Reverend Professor Ryszard Czekalski, I am pleased to welcome you to the first seminar Seminar on International Relations series organized by the Department of International Relations at the Institute of Political Science and Administration at Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński University in Warsaw. Our distinguished guest and today's speaker is Professor Aleksandru Grigorescu, Director of the Center for Research and International Affairs at Loyola University in Chicago. Professor Grigorescu will deliver a lecture entitled Lockean Liberalism, Recovering a Missed Opportunity for International Relations Theory, which will be combined with the promotion of the book entitled Lockean Liberalism in International Relations. Okay? So far, okay. I'm warmly welcome you, Professor Grigorescu, to our university and thank you for accepting the invitation to join us in an academic discussion and share your perspective on international relations in these turbulent times. I hope that this meeting marks the beginning of future fruitful cooperation between our universities. On this occasion, I would like to warmly welcome Mrs. Bożena Nowicka-Maklis. Unfortunately, she couldn't come today because she got sick yesterday. But as we told, that she will come to meet us in a different time, so far. Okay, so Mrs. Nowicka-Maklis is a representative of the Kościuszko Foundation from Chicago. I hope that the presence of the representative of the Polish diaspora of the United States will create opportunities to harness the potential of our university staff to promote knowledge about Poland abroad. I warmly welcome the staff and students of our university, the Faculty of Social and Economic Studies, Institute of Political Science and Public Administration, and Faculty of Law and Administration from our university. I'm delighted to welcome guests from the Faculty of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Warsaw. Are they already here? They will come. Yes, we have a very big traffic today, so probably they will come, as well as friends from our academic community. I wish you a good and fruitful seminar. Good luck. I would like to say I'm very sorry, but I have to leave because I supposed to start my lecture 14 minutes ago, so I have to go to work.
But 1 minute left.
Good luck.
Thank you very much for the opening, and I would like to give the floor to the Dean of our faculty, Professor Artur Wysocki, to welcome the guests and open the seminar.
Dear professor, dear participants of this seminar, of this meeting, I'm very glad also to see you at our university, but especially at our faculty. And I am glad that it is only the beginning, as I heard, of this cooperation, and I hope it will have it will be others opportunities to meet you and to cooperate with others, also maybe members of your university. I think that it will give us a good and new perspectives, not only on this international relationships, but also on other aspects of social sciences. And I hope also, because I am from the Institute of Sociology, that maybe it will be opportunity to cooperate also with your sociologists. Sorry, Director, that I am giving also the place for our interests, but I think that it will be also the opportunity to cooperate with them. So to not prolong too much, I would like to wish you to have good time here and to just enjoy this stay with us, and also to have the possibility to share also with other professors, but also with other students, all your experiences and your knowledge, and have a good time here. Thank you for coming. Yes.
Thank you very much for the welcoming and opening the seminar. I've got the pleasure to present also Professor Piotr Bajda, who will be chairing our today's seminar. So, Professor, the floor is yours, and let us wish a fruitful seminar.
Good morning, everyone. Let me introduce a little deeper our guest, because it's a unique opportunity to meet such kind of person. Professor Grigorescu is author of many of articles published in international journals like World Politics and International Studies Quality. Also, he is author of a few books on democratic intergovernmental organizations, on theory of international relations, and of course, the primary reason for our gathering today is his most recent book as co-author with Claudio Katz, Lockean Liberalism in International Relations. The last work applies a new variety of liberalism in international relations theory, drawn from the political thought of John Locke, focusing on the essential role of institutions in restraining the concentrated power of the state, and it forms the basis of today's lecture. I think that especially today, it's important to discuss on liberalism in international relations when more practical is realism in today's world. So maybe this lecture will give us another chance to understand better today world. Professor Grigorescu, it's truly an honor to meet you today, and we eagerly anticipate your presentation. The floor is yours.
And for the slides, I use this one for the slides to move in. Okay, I'm good. Okay. Hello. Thank you very much for being here. Let me start kind of on a personal note. This is the first time I'm in Poland, but I've been here for a few days, and it's an interesting feeling for me because I'm originally from Romania, even though I've lived in the US for the last 35 or 40 years or so. And there are a lot of commonalities, to be honest, that I see, especially for somebody who studies international relations. the Russians are kind of close to us in Romania, kind of too close. The US is a little bit too far. Europe is always very active, and there are things that countries like Poland, like Romania, kind of think in a similar way. So it's refreshing for me to come from the United States, where everything seems far away and small, to be back in Europe and in this part of Europe. Let me also mention something. We were just speaking earlier that even though I have a presentation, I always change it, and I kind of look at the people and I kind of figure out what I need to do to make sure that you're not going to fall asleep while I'm talking. And the book that I wanted to present is a recent book. It appeared last year, together with my colleague Claudio Katz. It's called Lockean Liberalism and International Relations. It's a very small book, but it came out of a collaboration. He's a political theorist, and I study international relations. And even though it's theory, and I want to make the argument that theory is relevant for practice as well. And all of the theories that have existed, whether in international relations or in domestic politics, have had implications, have affected people. So let me start with this idea. We have all these theories in international relations. You may or may not have heard of them, whether it's realism, there's constructivism. By the way, constructivism is what we consider to be the sociological turn in international relations. So yes, we copy from you as well, from sociologists, and I think sociologists copy from political science. It's a good collaboration. And there is always liberalism. And I asked the question, is there just one? And what I will show you now is, believe me, a simplified version of the various types of liberalism in international relations. Can we show that, Anna? Okay. So this is the simple version. There's a much more complex one. So if you look at liberalism as applied to domestic politics, not to international relations, there's the so-called classical liberalism. You have, Adam Smith in economics, Locke, Kant, Hume, Rousseau. There are many names. There are also there. International relations has imported strands of liberalism and applied them to what happens between states as opposed to what happens between individuals within a state. And the very first form of liberalism that emerges is the one of the interwar era, immediately after World War I. Woodrow Wilson is arguably the best known, we call them idealists, the liberals of the interwar era of the 1920s and 1930s. But there are others who wrote more than Wilson. Wilson was not just president, you may or may not know, he was actually a political scientist. He was president of the American Political Science Association. He was president of Princeton University, so somebody who liked to play around with ideas, and he had written things even before that. But Shotwell, Zimmern, they're better known. And the idealism of before World War II really borrowed most from Adam Smith and the idea of harmony of interests. So it's not surprising that after World War I, a war that for a lot of people shouldn't have happened because there weren't really, there was just miscommunication. People were surprised how World War I came about. People were not surprised, unfortunately, how World War II came about. That was pretty clear. But World War I, they were cousins, whether it was, Wilhelm and Nicholas, and they cooperated with each other. So a lot of people tried to understand what happened. And the simple story was miscommunication, misperception. We all have a common interest to avoid war. All we need to do is create the institutions where we talk to each other and discover that common interest. And that was the League of Nations. Well, I'm not going to go into the history of the League and everything that happened, but less than 20 years after the League was created, you have World War II. So obviously there's a reaction against idealism, that something is wrong with it, and that led in international relations to the theory of realism. realism, which I would argue is still the dominant paradigm in our field. But later, there were other forms of liberalism that emerged. I would argue that the most important one was the liberal internationalism, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. And liberal internationalism derives from Kant's writing. He actually has the Perpetual Peace, the book, where he explains, he's one of the few political theorists who does not just talk about politics within the state, but also politics between states. So that's a different form of liberalism. It's not just about let's cooperate, let's find our common interest. It's a little bit broader than that, and I'll explain it. But the point is, you see in that corner up there with classical liberalism, John Locke, the father of liberalism, the first of liberals. His theory is never really represented there. And within Locke's theory, there are a lot of interesting things, but arguably, or at least for me and for Claudio, my co-author, the most important aspect of that was the restraints on power. Right? John Locke emphasized that in order to have a functioning society, both domestically and internationally, you need to have restraints on power. So you see that dotted arrow over there from Locke all the way to the right where it says international institutions, restraints on power. Our argument is that this connection has not been made in international relations. So let me rephrase that. Liberalism, classical liberalism, has been borrowed by us in international relations from Adam Smith, from Kant, but really not from the others, and especially not from John Locke. Also in the 1980s, there's a very important strand of liberalism. It's called neoliberal institutionalism. We like to come up with fancy, long words to look smarter. This one is actually originated by Robert Keohane, which is considered one of the most important scholars of international relations. But his liberal theory derives from a very different strand. It's not from classical liberalism, it's from John Rawls. And John Rawls and Keohane simply emphasize cooperation, but not the kind of cooperation, the simplistic kind that you have in idealism. Let's just get together in the League of Nations, talk to each other, and we'll figure out how to cooperate. It's more complex. It's about negotiating, and it's a back and forth. So the dark arrows that you see, number 1 from Adam Smith, number 2 from Kant, number 3 from Rawls, is what international relations has copied from theories of liberalism. The arrows that I have there, the dotted ones, are what has not happened. So on the one hand, the most important one, we argue that nobody has tried to apply John Locke's theories, and especially the restraints on power, to international relations. But also there's something very interesting. There's something in political theory called realist liberalism. It emerges at the end of the 20th century. Judith Shklar is probably the most important of these scholars. And her argument is that liberalism, John Rawls' liberalism, an emphasis on cooperation, misses power. You have cooperation, but is that really cooperation, let's say in the UN, where you have the US, Russia, China, and they're so much more powerful. Obviously, she talks about it in domestic politics, not in international relations. So one of the arguments I make is it's interesting that in political theory, this idea kind of critiquing Rawls emerges, but nothing happens similarly. That other arrow from realist liberalism does not take anything as well. Okay, bottom line, I have 2 circles there, and I'm going to talk about these 2 versions of liberalism a little bit. The one on the left, because it's been the dominant one, liberal internationalism. Michael Doyle is the one who came up with this in the 1980s, but those of you who study international relations, you probably know much better the name of John Eikenberry, who has taken this. And I would argue, to go back to my idea that theories matter, it is an argument that American administrations, up to the recent one, up to the Trump administration, have been promoting it. It has applied in practice. So let's see if we can move this a little bit. This is the part I'm going to skip, the idea behind the relevance of restraints on power and John Locke, that is in the book in 2024, actually came from a previous book that I wrote in 2023. We can just skip over this a little bit because it's not that. Let's just put all of those there, Hannah, and yeah, let's leave it there. We can move even further. All right. See, there's a lot here. I'm not going to get into all of that. So the argument that I was making in that book is that international institutions have slowly, and let me emphasize that word, slowly, very slowly, started to apply some restraints on the powerful. The book was written in 2023. Obviously now I'm looking at it in a little bit of a different way, but I still believe the main argument. And the main argument in the book was that we can actually learn something about the international institutions and how they're evolving and how they're moving in a certain direction by comparing them to domestic institutions, national institutions. But, and this is what is new in my work compared to what others had said, but the institutions we need to compare them to are the ones from about 1,000 years ago. We should not be comparing them to current institutions. A Ministry of Defense and NATO are very different. A Ministry of Health and the World Health Organization are very different today. But if we go back enough in time and we look for these things, they start becoming similar. And I'm talking about the times of Magna Carta, the time in France when they had something called the Parlement, which was not a parliament. It was basically a court, and other very old medieval institutions. And why are these important? These were at a time when you had the king could do almost anything they wanted to in their territory. But slowly around that time, there were little things that they couldn't do anymore. Things were making it a little bit harder. Magna Carta is an obvious example. The emergence of parliaments that were initially very, very weak in Europe and other places. So the argument I make in that book is that if you look at how institutions, international institutions have evolved over the last 200 years, we've had international institutions since 1815. The Rhine River Commission is the first one, Universal Postal Union, and then you go, League of Nations, United Nations, so they're about 300, 500, depending on how you count these institutions. But over these last 200 years, these institutions have very, very, very slowly started developing some restraints on the powerful, just like domestic institutions did 1,000 years ago. All right. So I actually make some arguments. I test them. I find a process through which this takes place. I'm not going to go into detail because I want to make sure we have time for questions and answers. And I look for evidence of this. And I find that when you look at international courts, the PCA was the Permanent Court of Arbitration, established in 1899. That's the first international court. Then the Permanent Court of International Justice, that's part of the League of Nations. International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court. There is an evolution over the last 100 plus years in terms of what they can and cannot do. And of course, what's been going on with the ICC, and especially the US, but all powerful states not caring too much about what the International Criminal Court has to say, suggests that we're not there yet, that the restraints are not strong enough, and yet these courts I show, even if they don't take actions that run directly against the interests of these powerful states, they run counter to some of their other interests. There are a lot of decisions that the US wishes the International Criminal Court had not taken. China has decisions that it wishes it hasn't taken. The International Criminal Court and even the International Court of Justice have come up with decisions that powerful states don't like. They're not stopping them from doing things. They're not stopping Russia from going into Ukraine, obviously. But they're making it a little more difficult, a little more uncomfortable, just like courts 1,000 years ago were developing. So obviously this has implications that if the domestic institutions evolved in a certain way and the international ones have just started, it suggests something that might happen in the future. The same thing with international secretariats of organizations, international assemblies and parliamentary bodies, whether it's the Consort of Europe, the International Telecommunications Union, and so on. So bottom line, the findings of that book were that we're seeing in international institutions certain rules, certain things that have developed and become more, have applied greater constraints on the powerful. Let's move on. Thank you. All right, we can skip this. Okay, so let's do both of them. Thank you, that's fine. So based on that finding in that book, that something has been happening over the last 100 years, and slowly, very slowly, these international institutions are creating certain restraints on the more powerful. We moved to John Locke, who emphasized restraints on power as the essence of liberalism. And we asked the question that I start off from the beginning, is there something missing in liberalism? All other international relations scholars have not gone back to Locke, and especially have not gone back to this idea of restraints on power. The main variant, the main branch of liberalism that has been relevant in international relations is the so-called liberal internationalism that I mentioned. It's one of the circles that I drew. This draws from Immanuel Kant, and actually there are two scholars, Russell and O'Neill, who are writing in the 1990s, who say that Kant's argument is that what you need for peace is international organizations, more collaboration, democracy in states, and economic interdependence. If you have these three, peace is going to be more likely. We in the social sciences, as you know, we do not come up with deterministic statements. We come up with probabilistic statements. So the argument is the more democracy you have, the more free trade you have, the more international organizations you have, the less likely war is going to take place. That's not just theory. That's been practice. That is what American and many West European countries have promoted in terms of their policies. Let's export democracy. I'm not talking about now. I'm talking until 2015. Things have changed now. So the policies up to that point were more free trade, more international organizations, more democracy. And the understanding was the more you have of each, the better. War in Iraq, oh, let's establish democratic institutions there. Is it going to work? It doesn't matter. We have to implement them. Are these countries really ready for free trade? It doesn't matter. We have to push them to do that, whether we're doing it through the International Monetary Fund, whichever way we're doing it. So this was the old model of liberal internationalism, and as you can imagine, a lot of countries didn't like it. So when people talk about liberalism in international relations, that is usually what they think about. And when they talk about the liberal model and they critique it, this is what they are critiquing. We argue in the book that the other liberal model is the Lockean one, and the Lockean one is also based on three things. One of them is, and we draw this directly from his writing, that to have a peaceful process domestically or internationally, you have to have politics. That if you don't allow for politics, if you don't allow for back and forth, you're going to have conflict. Politics is murky, politics is not nice many times, but you need it. It's the only way to resolve issues. But Locke also acknowledged, he was writing after Hobbes, right? And he kind of took things from Hobbes, and he acknowledged that you also need power. In a society, if you're going to come up with rules and laws, you need the powerful there. You need to apply those things. So he acknowledged that you also need concentrated power. But because of that, and this was his big argument, when you have concentrated power, you also need to have restraints on that concentrated power. So it's a different so-called tripod. And we suggest that there's a different dynamic. I'm not going to go into all of the theory, but I just want to make the point here, it is different. And it leads to different implications and different practical implications. Anna, can we? Yeah. How much more time do I have? About 15 minutes, okay. So, this is a comparison of the two models, right? This is a comparison of, and I do want to talk about how things have changed as well. But the comparison is that in the dominant liberal approach that has existed certainly from the 1980s, 1990s, even 2000s, for about 3 decades, the assumption always was, these are the 3 legs. You need democracy, you need international organizations, you need free trade. They didn't include anything else, only these 3. And they talked about it as a tripod, right? A tripod, it needs to be stable. And if you know, a tripod, if you add a 4th leg or a 5th, it's not as stable. You've probably seen tables that have 4 legs and they're rickety a little bit, but never one with 3. A 3-legged table or a 3-legged chair is always perfectly stable, and this was the assumption of Russet and O'Neill, and to some degree Kant, that in the liberal international model, you need to have these 3, and you don't need to look at anything else. Poverty, development, it wasn't relevant. So you can imagine why this model in the global south countries was not embraced as much. Another, so the Kantian one is basically considers that there are no possible legs, but we suggest that there are many other possible legs. As opposed to the Lockean one, we suggest that it's exhaustive. We can talk about that at the Q&A. The nature of the relationship between the 3 legs, that is also important. In liberal internationalism, all of these 3 things are closely related. You have more democracy, you're going to have more free trade. You have more free trade, you're going to have more democracy. You have more democracy, you're going to have more international organizations. You have more international organizations. So all of these 3 are connected. And people have shown that countries that do one of those things do the other 2 things as well. In the Lockean model, we argue that they are complementary. And let me emphasize that because that is very important. If you disagree with one part of the liberal institutionalist model, you're probably going to disagree with some of the others because they're related. But if you disagree that power is important in order to have peaceful relations, you have the other argument that even though you need power, you also need to restrain power. Okay? And how are you going to restrain power? Through institutions. How do you develop those institutions? Through political processes. So bottom line, another difference between the 2, we argue, is that the nature of the relationship is complementary and not cumulative. The most important difference is something that I mentioned before, the relevance of power. A lot of developing countries, but not just developing countries, countries in Europe as well, always felt that this liberal internationalist model, the one emphasizing democracy, and don't get me wrong, democracy is good, free trade is good, international organizations are good, but the idea that everybody has to follow this model, it was especially difficult because who are the ones that were promoting this? It was the powerful. It was the powerful that were saying it was the United States, it was Western Europe, it was other countries that were saying, here's the model, you have to follow this. So this goes back to the argument that I mentioned earlier of Judith Shklar, who said that in this type of liberalism, the powerful, is it really cooperation? Is it really a common good, or are the powerful getting more than the others? Well, in the Lockean form of liberalism, both the powerful and the weak get something. The powerful are still needed. Let me be clear. The League of Nations failed primarily because they did not give powerful states a role. They were kind of equal. That's why the US never wanted to join the League of Nations. That's why Germany left, Soviet Union left, Japan left, Italy left, all these countries left. It was just France and Britain. And because of that, in 1949, when they established the United Nations, they understood that if they want to keep powerful states there active, talking to each other, and not have yet another war, they needed to give them some advantages. And the advantage was essentially a permanent seat with a veto in the UN Security Council. So we have done that. We need power. But in addition to the fact that we need power, at the same time, what can we do to restrict a little bit the power of those most powerful? And that is missing. So if there is a prescription, and now let me turn this into a more normative argument than what I've been making so far, is that liberalism is viewed in a lot of countries outside of Europe, outside of the United States, as the reason for a lot of the problems in the world. Liberalism is seen as a flawed view. I'm not talking about Europe, I'm not talking about the United States, but the rest of the world. And by the way, that's important because there are other models right now. There's a Chinese model. No democracy, international organizations maybe. Liberalism, yes and no. And a lot of countries are saying, well, why should we follow the American model? Why should we follow the Western liberal model? Because that does not apply to us. So the argument is that one of the reasons for these arguments is that the kind of liberalism that we've been using in international relations has been forgetting a key element to this and restraints on power. Now, I'm not naive to believe that all of a sudden Russia, US, China are going to say, oh yeah, you're right. We need to restrain our power. We're going to pull out of Ukraine. We're going to, Trump is going to, whatever you decide. Stop applying tariffs to countries. It's not going to happen. The argument is, first of all, a normative one. A lot of political theory is normative. We know that what's happening right now is not good. And here's what we should be doing. Or let me put it differently. The should, I don't think should be connected directly to liberalism, because by doing that, and especially to liberal internationalists, because by doing that, we are losing a lot of potential allies in this world. So my argument is that just as in domestic politics, very slowly, leaders have been restrained, in a similar way, international institutions with baby steps, whatever you want to call them, very, very slowly, years, decades, centuries, will also need to develop this. It's a normative argument. And just kind of to conclude with this right now, yeah, the United States right now obviously has very different policies than it had a year ago. Even 5 years ago, during the first Trump administration, there are very different policies in place right now. Most people would suggest that the policies of the US right now can be best explained by realism. It's a powerful state, it does what it wants. And that's true. But at the same time, what we've learned from domestic politics is that these moments come and go. It doesn't have to be that all presidents and future presidents in the United States are going to be the way that Donald Trump is right now. They're not going to have to be like Biden or Obama or anybody else. But as a general trend, what we have been seeing in international relations is the development of many international institutions that have slowly made it a little bit harder for powerful states to do what they want to. And we believe, and the literature suggests, that that may be the path forward from now on. Even if these are difficult times right now, in 10 years, in 20 years, if there is a path forward, we still need these institutions. We still need to have some restraints, just like in domestic politics. These institutions have led from the downfall of monarchs and kings to more democratic societies. So I'm going to stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for so interesting presentation. Now the floor is yours. It's unique opportunity to put a question to our guest. It's difficult to say when it will be another occasion. So who is going to be the first one? Oh, yeah. Nice.
Professor, thank you very much for very interesting contribution on a very important topic, because I share your general opposition to the dominance of realism in international relations, and how realism tries to convince us how to understand what is going on in international politics. But saying that, I have one question regarding Locke, because I have noticed that in your presentation you are very much focused on institutions, and you look at international politics through the institutions and the role of these institutions in constraining power, violence, which is becoming much and more a very grave problem in international politics. I remember from my study on Locke many years ago and his political philosophy, that one of the major ideas he tried to work out, for example in the two treaties, was the idea of the society and the way, the modes how society is created as a kind of social, political and economic association. And my question is, the reason, what was the reason why you have omitted in your presentation this aspect of Locke? Because if I would have to explain the impact of Locke on international politics and the liberal theory of international relations, I would start with rather this aspect of his philosophy. Society, for example, in the English School of International Relations, society as a way of constraining politics, not only domestic but also international, to explaining why the cooperation is needed and possible, why common good in international relations is conceivable, yes, imaginable and desirable. So this would be my question to you.
Thank you very much for the question. Although my first wish is that my colleague Claudio Katz, who is the political theorist, would be here to answer it. But I've learned a little bit from him as well. I'm going to try to answer that. So the first argument I'm going to make is Locke, like many of the scholars that we talk about, whether it's Kant, whether it's Rawls, and so on, is much more complex than somebody like me makes him out to be. So we chose the elements that we felt were relevant and were applicable, and especially keep in mind, they followed up on my previous study of international institutions. So we chose to focus on institutions because the literature had not really talked about that aspect. Another caveat that I want to present is we talk about institutions and we might be talking about very different things. Sociologists, when they say institutions, they don't necessarily mean the same thing that we mean in political science. The English school talks about institutions in a different way than Keohane and neoliberal institutionalism does. So for them, even civil society is an institution, but we do not emphasize that aspect. Let me think right now. I'll be honest, I didn't think about it, in part because we focus just on the international institutions and their evolution. But let me think right now what that would imply, and you tell me if you think I'm right or not, and it might lead to another article or to a book or something like that. The analogy would be global civil society as playing a role. And by the way, other forms of liberalism have emphasized the role of global civil society, whether it's international non-governmental organizations. I mean, the Catholic Church can be viewed as a non-state entity that plays an important role. I don't know, trade unions that cross. So there is research on that. I agree that they're relevant. I think that the literature that is most focused on that is actually started with Keohane and Nye wrote a book in 1977, Power and Interdependence. And that's when they bring in, for the first time, it's not surprising, this is the moment in the Cold War when things aren't just about the Soviet Union and the United States. There's a realization, well, you know, other entities matter, business matters, and NGOs matter, and religious groups matter, and so on. So the theory that came out of that was called complex interdependence, and I think that would be the argument. Is it a Lockean argument? Probably, but it wasn't mentioned as a Lockean argument. So bottom line, the short answer is I agree with you that we neglected it, in part because we felt it was included by others, and also because the emphasis was on international institutions, how they developed.
Next. So I have one provocative question. Please. Oh.
Thank you for the lecture. But the Kantian and the Lockean model are the Western models. And we can say also in the Kantian model, he was so happy with his idea that he also said that if the society will be composed out of the devils, this will work well, if only they will be rational. But I would say today liberalism is less and less attractive. The number of democratic countries is diminishing. The quality of democracy also on the West is diminishing. And if you will imagine the world where the main superpower are China, India, Russia, and the US will be the fourth or fifth only. So that the world will not become the global West, but something different. Will this Lockean model be applicable to this?
So yes, these are Western models, but only in the sense, only in the sense that the Kantian model has been embraced in international relations by Western countries. I would argue that small states should embrace a Lockean model that emphasizes restraints on power. And Poland is not a small country, but I would assume that Poland, just like Romania, would like greater restraints on the powerful. And we're seeing right now, you know, what can happen even to a benefic hegemon. Things can change anywhere. You can be benefic for 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, and then not be benefic anymore. So first of all, I would not call these Western models necessarily, but one of the problems I have is that the Kantian model has rightfully been seen as a Western model because Western countries have benefited from it and others did not. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Again, let me be clear. I've lived in a dictatorship for 26 years of my life. Of course I want democracies. Of course I think free trade is a good thing despite of what my current president believes. Of course I believe in international institutions or organizations. I wouldn't study them for the last 30 years. But by making this a formula that you're promoting left and right, this has eroded liberalism. The word liberalism is a bad word in many countries right now because of that. And the argument is it's because of a narrow interpretation of liberalism. So that is kind of, let me call it the theoretical response. The practical response is, yes, there are other countries, and that's one of the problems. The United States and Russia, yes, India, yes, but primarily I would argue that the United States sees itself in a competition with China. And this competition is obviously economic. It's obviously security and military. We count all their, you know, all their ships and all their rockets and all, then they count ours and so on and so forth. But like all great powers, like the US was locked with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, it's also about the hearts and minds. It's about who you can convince. So if you come with a model that is, you have to be democratic, open up free trade, do all of these things, we don't care if it hurts you right now, you're gonna be better off. And the Chinese say, no, you don't have to do all of those things. We'll just give you some money, you're gonna develop, you're gonna have wonderful roads, you're gonna be wealthier, democracy, maybe later, and so on. So of course the US, I would say, already lost that battle. Whether it's in Africa, a lot of places in Latin America, a lot of places in Asia, maybe even in Europe. So I believe that yes, we're going to live in a world where there are going to be multiple great powers. It's not going to be the US. And precisely for that reason, we cannot go blindly and say, here's what you need to do, accept it or not, because we know we're competing with the others. And I might be still further away from Russia than Poland is to understand really if the Russian model could become a model acceptable to others. I really hope not. Sorry, that's my Romanian side. But in terms of the Chinese model, it exists. A lot of countries are adopting it. It is not seen as liberal. It is seen as simply one for development. So I'd see this as a problem, and that's precisely where I think that the need for good theories that are going to be accepted by others is very important. I'm not sure if I answered the question or...
Who next?
You said about concentrated power and collective solution. What does it mean, concentrate power and collective solutions? Could you explain this?
I'm not sure when I was talking about collective solutions, in what context. Okay. To apply a collective solution. So, in domestic politics, power, you can consider power as being concentrated in the hands of the monarch, Louis XIV. Or you consider it concentrated in the power of the king and nobles that are close to him. So that's a different form. Similarly, we can think about the United States as being the sole superpower and have power concentrated there, or the United States and a handful of allies, whether it's the UK, France, and so on. Where this becomes more interesting is in international institutions, where even though it's not just one state, power is concentrated in the UN Security Council. And believe it or not, even though the US, Russia, and China do not agree on a lot of things, when it comes to the UN Security Council, they kind of do agree. I just published an article recently to show how similar the American and the Chinese positions on UN Security Council reform are. Of course they don't like it. It's an example of power being concentrated among the most powerful states. They can disagree, but on that they agree. We don't want an enlarged UN Security Council. We don't want a greater role for the UN General Assembly. We like the way it is right now. So the same thing in the World Bank, where you have a handful of countries, 3 or 4 countries, that can pretty much oppose anything that they want to. So when I'm talking about concentrated power, I'm trying to include both the superpower, if it's the US, or a group of states that come together and do things in a similar way. In the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, it's the US, but it's also Japan, Germany, Britain, France. So that was the term. A collective solution is the solution that these states, the powerful ones, find, and they want to apply to everything. The UN Security Council comes together and says, this is what we're going to do in Rwanda, or we're not going to do in Rwanda. This is what we're going to do in Afghanistan. And it's viewed as a collective solution, right? Because it's an international institution right there. That's a problem. You can't do that without having some restraints on those countries, because it's just like the king and the barons making those decisions and saying, oh, this is good for everyone. So I hope that I explained the concepts, but if not, I'm willing to take it a step further and try to explain.
I think that this wonderful lecture and the discussions we have shows us the meaning of and the necessity to explain the category of power viewed within the liberalism in the international relations, because as we speak about power, it is a main category for realism. Yeah, the power. While you've invited us to think about international institutions and their role to manage international issues and restrain powers of the most powerful countries. So the question is, and that might be in that theoretical context, how to deal with the category of power in modern international relations viewed from the liberal version of Lockean version of liberalism. And I think, and it is very interesting what you've said, that the category of power and the new meaning of managing power, establishing power, accepting the power in international relations might be the solution for keeping liberalism a main paradigm of international relations. How do you see that process?
Thank you. So first of all, let me say that I do not believe that the concept of power and its use is the sole fiefdom, the sole property of realism. We actually say that in political science, power is our currency. Just like for economists, it's all about money, for us, it's all about power. That's political science in general, not just international relations. That if you want to understand politics, you have to understand power. Well, the problem then is, what is power? And there, it takes us much longer to explain that, and it's complex. In international relations, there's a very simple way of thinking of it. It's about military power. If you really want something done, you're going to use military power. And of course, you can't forget economic power, because that is important too. And we use this word, fungibility. Fungible, we say that power is fungible. You can transform it from one way to another. You have enough economic power like China, you quickly transform it into military power. You have military power like Russia, you can try to transform that in economic power. You have both, like the US right now is trying to transform one into the other. But then there's a third form of power. Some people call it soft power. Others call it, there are different words for it. And let's go with soft power. The definition of soft power is the ability to get others to do what you want them to simply by convincing them. And if you think about it, that's what we do all the time in our daily lives. I mean, I have friends, I never threaten them with force, or I don't bribe them. If I want to go to a movie with some friends, let's say, I never do, but let's assume for a second that I would want to, I guess I could bribe them, but I don't. I try to convince them, let's watch this movie, it's much better, X is playing in it. That's what we always do. Well, believe it or not, states actually do that as well. If they wouldn't, there would be no diplomacy. That's what diplomats do. They try to convince each other, and they try to box each other in with arguments. So it's extremely important. Okay, so that's kind of the broader perspective of power. What does this bring to the conversation? Well, I would argue that the first aspect is that power is multifaceted. It's not enough to talk about just military and economic power. And the models that you offer, here's the way the world should be moving. Here, whether it's a Kantian model or a Lockean model, whatever you're doing, you are trying to gain partners. And that becomes important, because I don't want to be too, although I'm a political scientist, I like to say I don't want to be too political, but I do believe that the current administration is making a mistake in not emphasizing whatsoever the so-called soft power. The US has done away with USAID. That's not very expensive. You're helping people who, I'm sorry, dying of hunger in the world. You're helping people that have big health issues. So if you turn your back to them, they're not going to like you anymore, and they're going to like the Chinese or somebody else who is going to offer that aid. So in this battle between others, I would simply say that this matters, and the models that you use, the international institutions that you're going to use, it's much better, it's much easier to convince somebody if you do it through the UN than if you do it alone. Much easier. And let me just add something. I know you didn't ask me about this, but it's something that is kind of related to the discussions that we're having. What I found in domestic politics, and then also in international politics, and it was somewhere there, the part that I skipped over, it's not easy for these restraints on power to emerge. There is a certain type of moment when this appears. And those moments are when the most powerful state is declining and the other one is rising. Because if you're the most powerful state, if you're Britain, for example, at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, and you're looking and you're seeing the United States becoming more powerful, well, you're thinking ahead, what can I do? And one of the things that you can do is to create international institutions that are going to restrain the next powerful country. That is what happened, and that is how democracy and restraints on power developed domestically. When various groups and leaders were declining and they saw that others were having an advantage, that's when these institutions appeared. Because of that, my argument would be that, we were talking about what's going to happen with the US. It's going to be number 3, number 4, number 2. It's clear that right now, the US, even if it's not declining, it's not growing as quickly as China. So arguably, this would be a good moment for the United States now to say, okay, let's empower institutions. Let's make the rules meaningful, because we're going to need those rules 20 years from now or 30 years from now. My response to why isn't it happening, and we're seeing the exact opposite, is think about the term, make America great again. What does that mean? It means that half of the American public believes that the US can be once more, the most powerful country. What the US is doing right now is based on a belief that the US can be again number one, and it does not need these international institutions to tie it. If Americans would believe that China is indeed the next power, they would be much more interested in making the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the General Assembly, all of these institutions give them more bite. So again, sorry it wasn't directly related, but it was something that I felt was relevant for the broader conversation.
Thank you. Yes, among students.
So we were talking about how those both. Hello. We were talking about both of those models are applied more to the Western countries, and then we were talking about the power and weakness dynamics. And I was wondering if in your book or in this Lockean tribute, you were foreseeing who would be responsible for helping disadvantaged states like post-colonial countries, if that would be a collective solution, or it would be responsible of the superpowers, or how would it be covered?
Thank you, very good question. So, the smaller countries always want more restraints. That's clear, right? The powerful countries always want fewer restraints. And even though the US would like some restraints on Russia, it doesn't want to make the rules because then it would apply to the US. Even though China would like restraints on the US raising tariffs, it doesn't want to do that because it wants to maintain that power. So there's this interesting dynamic you would see. The very powerful and the weak have very distinct interests and nothing's going to happen. But my argument, and in the book, is it's the middle part that becomes interesting. It's the middle part, and it's the bureaucracies of international institutions. And when they join one side or the other, especially the weak, that's when change can take place. And I have examples from the evolution of the European Union over the last 70 years, even within the UN. Let me give you the most recent example, and I can't remember if it was, I apologize. It happened recently. There is an imbalance between the General Assembly and the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council can do pretty much what it wants to, and the General Assembly is relatively weak. After the war in Ukraine started, there was a recognition that you can't do anything to Russia through the United Nations. What countries were able to do, and was something that was led by Western states, but also by all the developing countries as well, they introduced a change where now if you veto in the UN Security Council, you have an obligation to explain your veto to the General Assembly within 3 days, I believe. Now, is that a big deal? No, Russia can say whatever it wants to. But it's one of those baby steps that I talk about. At least you have to explain it. It's different. Again, think about the king. King doesn't have to explain himself. But when he starts having to explain himself, at least he has to come up with something that the public might like. So those are examples, little things like that, where the weak have always pushed for a greater role for the General Assembly. But this time around, there were others that joined and were able to get that across.
Yeah, please.
This Lockean version of liberalism presented us. This it is a theoretical question, of course. Isn't it that Lockean liberalism that you've presented is already or was already in practice in Europe after the Second World War, when the 6 European countries decided to establish the first communities? Wasn't it about restraining the powers of hegemon of Germany? Wasn't it about to safeguard the peace and the power of France and other countries. So we've got in Europe a process of European integration. Couldn't it be seen as an example of Lockean liberalism?
Your question reminds me, when you publish a book or an article, you have reviewers, and they're anonymous. You don't know who they are. So they read and they give you advice, and you don't know who they are, and you respond to them. They know you. And in a book, they know who you are. In an article, they don't know who you are, and you don't know who they are. When we were actually writing this book together, one of the reviewers asked a very similar question. Isn't there already, especially in European scholarship, an emphasis on restraints on power? And the answer was yes. Pretty much anybody who talks about international institutions thinks about restraints on power, but they were not connecting it necessarily to Locke. And why is that relevant? It's relevant because this is, as the title of the presentation is, liberalism has missed something. So if you go with liberalism in the world and you tell them this is what liberalism means, please adopt it, and you're missing a very important part, exactly the one that they care most about, that's a problem. So I would argue that yes, there's a little bit of that, but it's still been missing. The second argument I would make is, well, yes, the restraints were on Germany, but Germany by 1946-47 was not Germany of 1939. The restraints that mattered by 1945, 1946 were the ones on the US and the Soviet Union. And there were no institutions that were created. So what happened in Europe was a relatively natural, and in fact, one of the arguments is it's easier to have restraints on power within a group of pretty much equals. I'm not saying that France and Germany and the UK are perfectly equal, but it's much easier to develop a European Union with restraints on power when all of these are equal, and when they're also thinking about the institution as kind of a balance to the US or the Soviet Union. So they're two different processes, but I agree in Europe something happened. Can it be explained by liberalism? I would argue that it can. But even there's something missing in it.
Yes, because as you are saying and responding to these questions, I have in mind the work of David Mitrany from the medieval interwar period of 1918, that he was thinking how to preserve a peace in Europe. And his answer was that we need to build a system that will allow us to in some way restrain or diminish the absolute sovereignty of the states in some way, that we need to do everything to force states to cooperate, to discuss, and to convince them that for their sake and for their good, it is necessary to establish international institution that will exercise or that will be powerful on their behalf. So there were some small works and some intellectual attempts to use that Lockean liberal vision, and as far as I can remember, it was also the way of thinking introduced by Ernest Haas in the 1970s, who wrote while being a scholar at Harvard University, a very famous and well-known work on Europe's integration, and he was trying to figure out how did it happen that six very different European states decided to lose their sovereign powers for the good of all. So it was his answer that they were all familiar that we need to give our sovereign states to international institutions to safeguard a peace and a power in Europe. So yes, I feel this intuition that Locke has, and I think that Europe might be in my opinion, the process of European integration a good example. But on the other hand, the process that evolved within the time might also be a kind of signal that there's also something wrong with this Lockean liberalism, that the power that was given to international institutions with time might be too powerful for the states. So, yeah, European perspective.
That's what I wanted to say. So first of all, I will never disagree with Mitreni as a fellow Romanian. And whatever he said, I completely agree with him. But you're right. There are European perspectives and I'm going to say non-European, whether it's American, Russian, Chinese, but definitely American perspective. You mentioned Ernst Haas and Kenneth Waltz is one of the biggest names in international relations. He came up with a theory of neorealism. And he passed away 3-4 years ago. And there was a round table for him at the International Studies Association. And one of the speakers was John Gerald Ruggie. He passed away in the last few years, also a very big name. And he was telling a story of when he was at Berkeley, Waltz was at Berkeley, and Haas was at Berkeley. And Ruggie was a new starting assistant professor, and the other ones were two of the biggest names in international relations. We're talking late 70s or something like that. And they had offices at the extreme end of the two halls, and they kind of admired each other, but they felt that the theories were completely useless. Waltz, if you've ever read Waltz, is also always about great powers, nuclear weapons, and what was going on in Europe that Haas was studying is irrelevant. It's all about U.S. and Soviet Union, how they're gonna kill each other off, and Europe coming together, it's irrelevant. And Haas felt that what Waltz was doing is too theoretical, irrelevant for the real world. Look what's happening in Europe, and look at the cooperation. It's just an example of how it depends on what you look at. If you're interested in restraints on the most powerful, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, you're not going to look at the European institutions. If you're interested in developments in Europe because you live in Europe, of course, you're going to be doing that. And I saw that there was a hand from a student. I want to make sure that be. Yes.
Yes, you would like to ask the question? Yes, so please do.
Thank you for a good lecture and interesting also.
Speak louder because
Yes, no problem. Thank you for a good lecture and also interesting. You have talked about the soft power. I want to ask the question based on your knowledge and experience. Do you think that, because in Europe we have now for many years liberalism, but do you think that other models that have soft power can go over it and dominate? I mean, we live in Europe now, we have the postmodern society, so that's my question.
So if I understand correctly, the question is if there are other models, for example, in Europe, besides the liberal model, right?
Yes, exactly. And do you think like it can go over it? I mean the liberalism.
Yeah, there are entire groups of people who are asking this question, and it's an important question, and especially in Europe. There's actually a group around if somebody speaks German, they might know. It's called the WZB. It's the Berlin Social Science Institute. It's one of the most important centers. Michael Zorn is the director of that, and they've had for about the last 6 or 7 years an enormous project asking about what's happening now that the liberal model is being eroded. And they were asking this, again, 5-6 years ago. It didn't just start this year with this question. And I think that the answer to that question is, whenever you have a model, what are you comparing it to? Right? So if we're saying that liberalism is being eroded, are you comparing it to the Chinese model? Meaning less democracy, more protectionism? If that's the case, that model seems to be succeeding these days. Based on our experience, World War II started after protectionist policies. The so-called Smoot-Hawley Bill was adopted in the United States. And because the US imposed tariffs on others, then the whole world reciprocated. Trade went down to about 1/3 of what it used to be, and the World Depression started after that. So are there other models? Yes. Are they good models? I don't know. So I'm not saying, I think my answer to your question would be, we have labels to make things easier for ourselves. We call this liberalism. But if you look at what is under the liberal umbrella, I do believe democracy should be promoted, and I hope that most people in most Poland, US, and elsewhere believe in that. I also believe that free trade needs to be promoted. I also believe that the best way for countries to figure out the best solution is through international institutions. So everything that liberal internationalism has been saying, I still believe it's there, and I think most people still believe in those things. But in addition to that, I believe that what's been eroded is listening to the weaker ones, giving them a say in it as well, and not necessarily allowing them to run quickly to another model, which is the Chinese model, just because we're saying either you go with us or you go with them. Finding certain things from them, that's... Yes, it's true. So in a way, this model says, do what we're doing. But now, actually, I would argue that in the United States, there are a lot of problems with, talk about soft power. How can you promote democracy when at home you are doing certain things that many countries are not going to consider democratic at all? So it's even harder to lead when you yourself are eroding that model. How can you promote free trade when you're the main country that is instituting tariffs? Those are really important questions, by the way. They're very current questions. And of course, a little theory like ours is not going to solve these problems. But I think everything that we're seeing in international relations, one of my arguments is that nothing is completely new in this world. We've seen similar situations in the past, to some degree or the other. And if we look at the patterns that we saw in the past, we can learn from them, and those patterns are the ones that give us theories. Theories are really generalizations, and our generalizations are based on what we've seen in the past. So I would move away from simply saying that a model is good or bad to saying what has happened before, what can we learn from those, and what can we add to the theoretical approach that we are using right now. Right, but again, then you get into the whole thing, everybody has different interpretations of the past, so that's another question, but I'm not going to get into that
I
one.
hope that this theoretical discussion will stay in the minds of our students, who I hope probably will be public officials after finishing the studies. Maybe some of them will be in charge of foreign policy, maybe some of them will be our future prime ministers, so at least they will have this insight and this knowledge about the possibility to do the politics in a different liberal way. So it's very important to...
Let me add an argument to that, because I'm a firm believer in people who go in the policy world and getting jobs and understanding theory. If you only understand the policy in a certain moment in time, here's the policy, here's what the EU is telling us to do, here's what Poland is doing, here's what the Prime Minister is saying right now, you're a very good bureaucrat, but that's all. You're not going to be able to come up with new ideas. If you want to come with ideas that your bosses are going to like, or not like, doesn't matter, but at least you're trying, you need to be thinking much more broadly. And to be able to think much more broadly, you need to think, as I was saying, the question that we like to ask in political science is, what is this an instance of? Whatever we're seeing right now, did it happen before, or is there a theory out there, a generalization that will help me understand this? By doing that, you become not just a bureaucrat, you become a really good bureaucrat, one that your boss is not going to fire in a couple of years. So that is my argument to my students. I'm not sure if it applies to you guys, but that's what I tell them. You have to think. Okay, you have to think as broadly as possible, because this is a very competitive world. Getting jobs these days, I'm sorry to say, is not easy, and then keeping them is not easy, so you have to have a flexible mind. You may agree with me or not, but I always say.
We do totally agree, and we are talking to our students and giving them the same argument. So thank you.
But I think that is the best conclusion and the best message to our students. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you, especially to Professor. And I hope it was not last time when we have such kind of opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much.